Hello everybody and welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex and today's topic is a limited look at Magic's core resources. So this is a topic that you might know already kind of implicitly. I think a lot of players know implicitly, but it's one of those topics that I think is really, really important to talk about in specifics, kind of so you can get the vocabulary running, and so you can kind of like, if you can think about this idea a little bit better, you can translate it into words and then you can apply it to your gameplay. To give you a bit of a big picture overview on what it is, what we're going to be talking about today, is the core resources in Magic refers to the fact that Magic is, a resource game, a game based on resource management, and we generally have three resources at our hand, right? We have cards, we have life, and we have time / tempo mana. That one gets a little bit fuzzy, but we'll get into the fuzziness of that one. But before we jump in, I just want to give a baseline of that's generally what we're talking about today, resource management. And the really cool thing about this topic in particular is that, like I said, I think a lot of people understand resource management and those three resources, but if you can really get a better foundational understanding of all these three resources and how to apply them, I think it really improves not just your drafting, not just your card evaluation, but like your deck building and especially your gameplay. I think gameplay is one of the areas that you might not think this comes into play as much, but I find myself using these, thinking about this framework a lot in my gameplay to figure out what the best play is in each situation. I first heard about this concept from PV, Paulo, Vitor, Damo, Rosa. He wrote an article about it a few years ago at this point on channelfireball.com called The Core Resources, and he talks about, just generally talking about the concept, talking about what it's all about. But he applies what he's talking about in that article to constructed. He talks about constructed matchups and how to prioritize each resource in each matchup, what resource is the most important, so you can like best carry out each matchup, right? But of course, as us limited players, that's not as applicable. So what I want to do to kind of build on that a little bit today is talk about the core resources from a limited perspective, how you can apply it, again, how you can use it to improve your gameplay, card evaluation, deck building, all the above. Before we jump in, of course, I want to give a quick shout out to the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. That's the place you can go if you want to support the show. Want to give a huge shout out to all the patrons who joined this week. Saw a lot of support. Really, really, really appreciate it. Keeps the lights on, as I always say. And of course, if you choose to join, if you choose to support, we'll give you some rewards back. There's a bunch of reward tiers over there, ranging from Discord rewards to coaching rewards to draft log and deck review rewards, especially with the new set coming out in about a month. Now might be a good time, as I feel like the most value you can gain is at the beginning of a new set. That way you're not straggling in the beginning of a new set. You can get all the help you need right away, get right into it and start winning drafts. So that's what it's all about, right? So yeah, thank you so much if you did join the Patreon this week, or all of our continued patrons as well. Huge thanks to those people. And if you like my content, if you like what we're doing here, if you feel like you've learned something at some point, consider checking it out, because I think Patreon is the best way to support me as a content creator if you would like to do so. So let's jump in. So I want to talk about each of these three resources first: cards, life, and time, or tempo mana. Again, like I said, I'll explain the fuzziness there as we get into it. But I think that when I read PV's article, and by the way, I'll link that in the show notes. Maybe somebody in chat can post it for people in chat. It was kind of a light bulb moment for me, a limited level up, if you will, in the sense that I did know, I knew about card advantage, I knew about, how important tempo was, but I didn't quite understand how they were all interconnected. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today in depth, how understanding how these resources and how they are connected, and the trade-offs you make when you prioritize one over the other. That's a really key piece of the puzzle here that we're going to talk about today. So let's just jump into it. Basically, let's talk about cards first. Cards is, I think when you learn Magic, when you learn any card game, really, card advantage is one of the most important and the first things you learn about. Where if you have the most cards, you're probably going to win the game, right? And, that's true for the most part. There's exceptions here and there. Some of those exceptions we'll talk about, but this is the most easy to grasp resource. I think the more cards you have in hand, the more cards you have in the battlefield, the more, game pieces you have to work with, the more you can kind of put together a win somehow. Life is another resource that, as a Magic player, if you're, somewhat experienced, you'll know that life is indeed a resource. It's not just a score. It's not just like, I'm at 20 life, that means I'm winning. It's a resource just the same as cards are, and you can use it as a resource. You can take damage either from cards. There's cards that let you pay life to draw cards, but also just in the sense of like, I'm going to take some damage here, use my life as a resource so that I don't have to trade off my cards, right? So I'm up on cards, but down on life, right? The third resource that, again, is a little bit kind of tricky to figure out is time. So the most broadly applicable application, the most broad use of time is mana, right? Really, just like how much mana can I use to make use of my cards, right? Because if you have a bunch of cards in hand but only 2 lands, you're not going to be able to use all those cards, right? If you have more mana in play, well, you can use all those cards in hand. Where this gets a bit fuzzy is when you consider bounce spells, right? Like something like Unsummon, single blue mana, return target creature to its owner's hand, right? That is also buying you time in a sense because, if you bounce your opponent's creature, that creature's not killing you, but also you've wasted your opponent's mana in a way, right? Another card that you can think of is Dark Ritual. This is not, really a limited example, but Dark Ritual, single black mana, instant, add black, black, black to your mana pool, right? In that sense, you're trading a card for mana, for time essentially, right? You're trading one card. You don't gain a card from this. It just evaporates into thin air. You're not trading with one of your opponent's cards, but you're able to deploy more of your cards quicker, right? That's something to look at. And another way you can look at time/tempo is mana accelerants, or just getting more mana into play, right? So something like Llanowar Elves, right? Single green mana for a 1/1. Add, tap, add green. Just a mana dork. Any mana dork. Where this isn't really worth a card a lot of the time, right? It's a 1 mana 1/1. You wouldn't put that card in your deck, but it does help accelerate you, helps you cast all your other cards, right? There's ways to turn the Llanowar Elf into a creature or into a real card to convert your your time resource into cards. You can suit it up with equipment. You can sacrifice it for value, stuff like that. But in the broadest terms, this is not a full card. It's really just accelerating you, helping you cast all your other cards, right? And the thing to realize that I was kind of the thing to really understand about all these resources is they're all intertwined, right? Cards, life, tempo. When you cast a divination, 3 mana, draw 2 cards. You're trading time for cards, right? You're tapping 3 mana, and that 3 mana isn't used to, affect the board or anything, and, your opponent's probably attacking you for some amount of damage, so you're taking some life there, but you're up resources. You're up the cards resource, right? Similarly with the time resource, right? Where it's like, okay, this Unsummon, it's evaporating into thin air after I cast it, but it buys me some time, right? And you kind of, it kind of works in a cyclical nature where cards feed into life feeds into time feeds into cards. There's a bunch of cards that can exchange cards for life for cards, time for cards. Go through every single, magic card in existence. You can probably say, hey, this card, if it's not just a creature, like a 4 mana 4/4, if it's a spell, you can probably say, hey, this card exchanges cards for life, or life for time, or time for cards. You can really categorize cards like that. And one of the tricky things about that is focusing on one resource often comes at the cost of other resources, right? So the example PV used in his example, in his article, which I really liked, was it's like a short blanket, right? So if you prioritize cards, right? If you're prioritizing casting a bunch of card draw spells, well, the blanket, if you're pulling it over your head, your feet become exposed, right? And you probably go down in life and go down in time/mana, right? Because you're spending the mana. Similar with time. If you prioritize time as a resource, you're playing, you have a bunch of lands in your deck, or you're playing a bunch of unsummons or something, well, you're going down cards, right? Because those Llanowar Elves, like I said, aren't real cards, quote unquote. They can't usually trade for your opponent's cards. And the unsummons aren't going to trade for the opponent's cards either. They're just, evaporating into thin air. So you really want to consider the resource you're giving up if you're putting stock into one of the other resources, right? And this is applicable for card evaluation, for drafting, for gameplay, right? You should aim for a balance of all three of these resources during the draft and gameplay, right? A good deck or a good card or a good game state is one that you have an equal amount of all of these. Now, it's very hard to have exactly the right amount of all of them, but the winner of a game of Magic is often the one who has exactly the right amount of mana, the exact right amount of cards that do something, and enough life to be able to capitalize on them, to be able to leverage all those resources you have, right? And that's not something that just comes easily. That's something where you're like, in the draft, you go, okay, well, I already have a bunch of card draw spells. I don't need those. I should probably prioritize, 2 drops, 2 blocks, so I have enough life, and I can spend my mana in the late game to cast these card draw spells, right? In gameplay, you can go, okay, well, I've got a lot of cards in hand, but I don't have a lot of mana, right? So I'm probably going to want to extend the game, trade off, so that I can capitalize on all the cards in my hand. And I can go, I'm not worried about trading off my 2-drop. I'm just going to go trade it off so I can cast my 5-drop later, basically. And it's interesting, if you look at some of the best decks through, some recent formats, some formats we've played in the past year or two, the best decks and the best cards kind of naturally offer all three of these resources, right? If you look at Cycling in Ikoria, which is just like the quintessential, this deck kind of has it all, right? It is a super, super efficient deck, so it can operate on a low land count, right? You often went to 13 lands in the deck. Part of that was because you had the 1-mana cycler, so you'd be accruing lands as you cycled, but part of it was also you didn't need that many lands in play to do much, so it's like you don't need to get to 5 lands or 6 lands, that's like some decks do, and so that's just like a huge benefit over decks that are trying to cast 6-drops, right? You never really ran out of cards because, cycling often generated an effect, right? So you were like, triggering your Prickly Marmoset, triggering your token makers that made tokens as you cycled things. So you're like, all of your cycling cards were kind of 2-for-1s, right? And that's just like, you just never run out of gas often in that deck. And as far as life goes, right, like, you just, number one, you didn't care as much about your life total because you were trying to end the game quickly. You were the aggro deck a lot of the time. But also there was stuff like Zenith Flare that just like bought you a lot of time. Sometimes you're in a tricky spot where you're like, okay, I can't Zenith Flare their face to kill them, but I can cast it to gain me 8 life, kill their creature, and then I can just like keep going off from there. There's cards like Dranith Healer, which whenever you cycled a card, you gained a life, right? That just bought you so much time to be able to do whatever you needed, do whatever find the pieces you needed, find your other Zenith Flare or whatever. We look at another example. We have Kalain, Reclusive Painter, which is emblematic of Black-Red, right? If you think of Black-Red in AFR, it's very similar too, where it's a deck that, again, it doesn't need that many resources to get going because its cheap cards are impactful, but also like it provides you mana from the treasures, right? So you're never really short on mana. It's a deck that had a lot of card advantage with hired Hexblade to draw you a card. It's a 2-for-1 using your treasure. There's stuff like Deadly Dispute. Obviously, the Steel and Sap combo is a form of card advantage. And as far as life goes, it's kind of a similar space where it's like you're a mid-range, aggressive, proactive deck, so you don't care as much about your life total. But also, there are ways to gum up the ground to. If your life total is under duress, you can choose to block, right? There's a bunch of stuff like Shambling Ghast. There's like the Merchant, the 1/4 Merchant. I can't remember the Merchant's name. It's a Skullport Merchant. You have Skullport Merchant. That thing buys you a lot of time. Opponent's not going to aggro you out because that thing's going to block all the 2-drops and you have all the time in the world to carry out your game plan. So when you're trying to evaluate, what makes a good deck, it's often a deck that can naturally offer you all three of these resources. So now that we've kind of touched on this a little bit, I want to bring this into the lens of looking at the resources through card evaluation and deck building and gameplay. And we'll start with card evaluation here. So cards as a resource, not every game comes down to cards as a resource, as like if the game was just about who can draw the most cards, then every card that said draw 3 cards on it would just be an amazing card, right? A lot of games do come down to life total. They do come down to time and tempo and how much mana you have, right? the most limiting factor on a card that draws you cards is the mana you spend, right? So we have Jace's Ingenuity here, which is, 3 blue, instant, draw 3 cards. Reasonable card. It's a card that's better in some formats than others, and that's, another part of this puzzle where card advantage is a more important resource in some formats than others. Some formats are just too fast and you don't care about it as much, but in some formats it's like, okay, the games are going to grind out and cards are all that matter. But Jace's Ingenuity, you're trading time and mana to draw 3 cards. Is that a good deal? And in the abstract, this is an okay card, but you want to be, like I said, in a format that is conducive to that, but you also want to be set up in a deck where, you can generate more mana with mana elves to make use of this card. Or you're in a deck with a lot of cheap cards. You have a lot of 2-drops to trade off, and after you've 1-for-1 your opponent with, trading off your creatures and casting removal spells, you can fill up again, leverage that trading off by drawing 3 cards, right? So when you're looking at card draw spells and when you're evaluating them, the most limiting factor is the mana cost, really. You don't really want super expensive card draw. The cheaper it is, the better. Obviously, we'll get an all-time great here like Ancestral Recall, single blue mana, target player draws 3 cards. The reason that card is busted is because you're not taking a hit to mana, right? It's just super efficient to draw 3 cards. So you're up a resource and you're not really paying another resource, right? Like, you're paying a mana for sure, but that mana is kind of inconsequential. You can fit that in anywheres, right? So the best card draw spells are ones that are tempo positive. So that's something to think about going forward. Another thing to think about just in general about evaluating cards are the best cards are often ones that offer you 2 out of the 3 resources. 3 out of the 3 resources, ideally, that'd be awesome. But 2 out of the 3 resources are awesome. If they can, draw you cards, gain you life, or, ramp you and gain you life, or ramp you, draw a card. That's a sign of a really, really good card because you're kind of covering multiple bases, right? Something like Jace's Ingenuity, like we just talked about, that only covers one base and leaves you open to, getting dealt a bunch of damage, or, you having to tap out 5 mana and your opponent's attacking you and you just can't leverage those cards. A card like Sphinx's Revelation, which was a standard all-star, so this is X blue, white for an instant, you gain X life, draw X cards. The reason this card is so good is because you draw, a big, 3 cards, you sink 6 mana into it, draw 3 cards or something, but you also gain a bit of life, and when you gain that life, you gain the time to be able to cast those cards, right? That's critical about this card. A similar card, Blue Sun Zenith, which is X blue, target player draws X cards. That card's considerably worse because, barring infinite mana scenarios where you mill your opponent out because you make them draw their deck. But that card's significantly worse in most situations because it doesn't give you that life buffer to be able to cast the card. Another example is Serulf's Packmate, which, classic Call Time All-Star, 4 mana, 3/3. When Serulf's Packmate enters the battlefield, you draw a card and has Foretell for 2 mana. This is similar, where it doesn't actually quite look like it's giving you 2 resources, but it is, right? Serulf's Packmate is a 2-for-1, but it's a better 2-for-1 than something like Divination, 3 mana, draw 2 cards, because it is gaining you life in a way, or, tempo, if you want to put it that way. It's giving you 2 resources. It's putting you up a card, right, in the card you draw, but it's also putting you up a card in the 3/3, and that 3/3 can be traded off for, your opponent's 3/3, or maybe it eats a removal spell or something, right? So not only does Serulf's Packmate give you that card up front when you enter the battlefield, but it puts something on the battlefield, and that makes up for the fact that, a lot of card draw spells don't affect the board. This one does. That's huge. So we all know the cards that, enter the battlefield, draw a card, generally good, but this is the fundamental reason why they're good, because they give you another resource, not just the card. Looking at something like Deadly Dispute, right? 1 black instant as initial cost to cast a spell, sacrifice an artifact for a creature, draw 2 cards, create a treasure token. Anybody who's played AFR is very familiar with this card. The reason this card is good outside of the Steel and Sack deck, I'm just happy to put this card in any black deck, is again, it gives you 2 resources. It gives you the cards and the treasure to cast the cards, right? And the other thing about this is kind of like it almost gives you like an Ancestral Recall vibe where, any card draw spell that is tempo positive, and this isn't always going to be tempo positive, but it's very close to tempo positive in the sense that, like, you're not spending as much mana, or you're spending mana to draw cards, but you're still getting the mana back. That's super, super powerful. So that's why Deadly Dispute is just a good card in the format. It's not like a synergy card like we've seen it in the past, where it's like, we've seen this card that doesn't give you a treasure back, and that's been a much, much worse card. So that's cards. Let's move on to life as a resource and talking about it, because I do think this one is the most misunderstood. There's like the age-old question of how much life do you have to gain for it to be worth a card, right? If you just had a card that was like, I don't know, 3 mana, gain X life, right? And what does X have to be a card you would be willing to put in your limited deck, because it's like, this is enough life for where it's like, you know, it's kind of a virtual card draw, because it buys you 3 turns, and over the course of those 3 turns, for example, you'll draw 3 cards, right? And I think the closest we've ever come to that is a card called Gnaw to the Bone, which is 2 and a green for an instant. This is a common from Innistrad. And it says you gain 2 life for each creature in your graveyard, and it has flashback for 2 and a green. So what would often happen in Innistrad was, it was a self-mill set, so you'd fill up your grave with self-mill stuff, and this card would gain you 20, 40 life a lot of the time, right? And you could just never die if you cast this card twice, right? Because it's just like, okay, this buys me so much time. And we don't usually get cards like this, so it's you don't often think about it like this, because you can't often put a full card's worth of value into just gaining life. Classically, we know cards are just like gain 7 life or gain 5 life aren't good cards. You don't want to put those cards in your limited deck. There was a point where that number becomes so large that it is worth it. And so like that's something to look out for in the future when we're evaluating cards, where it's just like often people write off just pure life gain, but there does come a point where this is worth a full card in the right deck, where you're looking to buy time to leverage card draw, or just to like get to the late game. That's going to be a good card. Where life gain comes up the most, I think, in cards and card evaluation, is incidental life gain, and we've seen this a lot recently with Story Seeker / the Paladin from AFR. Any 2-mana 2/2 lifelink has always overperformed, right? Just almost universally in any format. Even in Dominaria, the 2-mana 2/2 lifelink there, which, Dominaria was a format that classically the 2-drops were bad, and you wanted to not put 2-drops in your deck that weren't good in the late game. But 2-mana 2/2 lifelink, that card, if I remember correctly, when the MTGO stats for that card came out, it was actually the most winning white common. So even in a format where 2-drops are at a disadvantage, it was still very good. And I think the reason for that is that, like, just giving yourself that free life buffer, that free resource, is, like, at a cost of basically nothing, because you're on a lifelink creature, right? That buys you a lot of time. And again, we're talking about resources feeding into each other. That buys you a lot of time to cast your other cards, to not have to like make trades aggressively, because like if you're at 30, you don't really have to make a trade if your opponent's attacking you. You can just keep your card on board, right? If you're at like 15 or something, you might have to go, okay, I have to trade off my 2-drop because I don't want to die, I don't want to go to 0, I don't want my opponent's 2-drop to keep attacking me. But if you started the game at 30, let's say, you wouldn't have to make those early trades. You could just keep your cards on board, not have to trade off, and then just go from there, right? So while life gain is often not worth a full card, the value of gaining life is really powerful, and anything with incidental life gain is really powerful, I think. So another card that comes to mind is Aven of Enduring Hope, right? This is 5 mana, 3/3 flyer. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life. This was a sleeper for a while. This is from Hour of Devastation. It was also in Amonkhet Remastered, if you played that recently, where it's like, the more incidental life gain you have in your deck, the more you're just like not going to die to random aggro starts, the more you're not going to die to, falling a little bit behind on mana because you have a little bit more time to catch up. So the big picture thing I want to point out here is, while life gain is not worth a card on its own, incidental life gain is kind of broken. And I don't want to use that term flippantly, but if all your cards came in and just said like gain 1 life, that would be, if you had like an emblem that just said that, you'd be at quite an advantage, right? So that's just something to think about going forward and when you're evaluating cards. And of course, the last resource we want to talk about here is time. This is, like I said, the one that does get a little bit fuzzy as we get into it. We're going to start with, Dark Ritual here, the card I was talking about. Single black mana, black for an instant. You add single black mana, instant. You add black to your mana pool. So the reason we don't play this card in Limited, and we do play the card in Constructed in some decks, is that the things you're powering out in Constructed are a lot more powerful. So you're much more willing to trade time, or a full card for time, right? If you can cheat out a big threat that like ends the game in 2 turns, that's really worth it, because who cares about how many cards you're down? That thing's gonna end the game. We generally don't have those types of cards limited, so we don't put stuff like Dark Ritual in our deck, right? But it's worth noting that that concept can apply sometimes, right? So like, if you ever have mana producers like Jaspira Sentinel, right, from Call Time, like, again, you're not up a card by putting that card in your deck. You're down a card when you cast the card, but casting your expensive stuff early can often put you at a really large advantage. The thing I want to caution when we talk about mana elves, though, is I think they get played a little bit too often, in the sense that I think people just jam them in their deck because, you know, mana elves historically are powerful. When you put mana elves in your deck, you really, really want them to be serving a function. If your deck is like fairly low curve, you have like a few 4-drops, a few 5-drops, I generally don't want to put a card like Jaspira Sentinel in my deck, because it becomes not a card too quickly, right? If my deck is full of 6-drops and 5-drops, totally, because its value is going to, I'm going to be able to use this card for multiple turns. But for example, in Kaladesh Remastered, Druid of the Cal, which is the 2-mana mana dork, 1/3 taps to add a green mana. That was a card I think people overrated a lot if they didn't have expensive cards or a lot of card draw. Because what would happen is, like, you know, they'd be a pretty low to the ground red-green deck or something, and they'd have like 3 4-drops and like 2 5-drops, right? And sure, getting a 4-drop out early is, you know, pretty valuable, but what if they just kill that 4-drop, right? Well, you're down 2 cards almost in that sense, where it's like the mana dork that you played, sure, it can help you cast your spells a little bit, you know, in a timely fashion, but that often isn't as relevant as I think people make it out to be, where in most games of Limited, just like being up card quality and raw cards is better. Like, a lot of times that Jaspira Sentinel would have been better as a 3/3, or sorry, the Druid of the Cal would have been better as a 3/3 with a minor ability or something like that, right? So really consider if your deck wants a mana dork. I think that's really, really important. We're looking at a case study here. Prosperous Innkeeper. This is a card that, when I first read, by the way, this is the card from AFR, 2 mana, 1 green, 1/1 uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you create a treasure token, and whenever another creature enters the battlefield, you gain 1 life. When I first read it, I was like, oh, that's a really powerful card. This strikes me as a powerful card. 2 mana mana producer that also has an additional effect. That's great. Oh, I should also caveat, if your mana dork does something other than produce mana, that is a sign of a good mana dork. So like, there have been in the past some mana dorks that are like, I tap to add mana and then I can like pay 5 mana to become a 5/5 or something like that. Werebearer is a really old example of, like, it was like 2 mana, 1/1, tap to add green, and then if you had 7 cards in your graveyard, it became a 4/4. If you can find a way to make your mana dork into something bigger after it's done its job, or better, or trade off for a card, that's really valuable as well. That's the exception to don't put this card in your deck if you don't have a lot of 4s and 5s or a lot of card draw. If you can turn that mana dork into something real, right? Another example of that is Call Time with Jaspira Sentinel, right? A lot of times in Call Time, because you were putting equipment in your deck, the Jaspira Sentinel did its job early, right? And then you can just put a Dwarven Hammer on it or put an Elven Bow on it and it became a real card, right? So that's another thing to consider. But back to Prosperous Innkeeper, sorry. I read this card and I was like really impressed by it, and I was surprised that a lot of people weren't that impressed by it when I first saw it. And even today, I see a few comments in chat when I'm streaming when it's like, oh, I know Prosperous Innkeeper is good, but I can't quite wrap my head around why it's good, right? And, you know, the answer is really obvious if you look at it through the lens of what we've been talking about today. This gives you 2 resources, right? It gives you mana, it generates mana, and maybe fixes your colors if that's something that you need to do, but also gives you incidental life gain. So all the things I've been saying about incidental life gain apply to Innkeeper here, but it also is a mana producer. So it plays that 2 roles. It gives you 2 resources, which is such a valuable trait in a card, right? Aside from, you know, all the synergies in the format for life gain as well. The big baddie, here's another case study here, is Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath. So if you're a constructed player at all, or if you play Theros Beyond Death Limited, you know this card, but I'll read it for players who maybe don't fall into those camps. This is 1 green and a blue for a 6/6, and it says, when it enters the battlefield, you sacrifice it unless it was escaped. Uro enters the battlefield. whenever Uro enters the battlefield or attacks, you gain 3 life, you draw a card, and you may put a land from your hand onto the battlefield, and then its escape cost, which basically just means you can cast it from your graveyard, is green, green, blue, blue, then exile 5 cards from your graveyard. So the play pattern for this card is generally you play it on 3, it gains you 3 life, it draws you a card, it puts a land into the battlefield, right? And then later it comes back as a 6/6 and it can start attacking and do the same thing. The reason this card is so busted is because it does all 3 things, right? It ramps you, it draws you cards, and it gains you life. And when you're trying to fight a deck on the opposing side of the battlefield, usually you can exploit a certain axis, right? If they have been drawing a bunch of cards, you can punish that by attacking them, right? If they make a bunch of, are generating a bunch of mana, well, something like a discard spell can punish them because you like rip out their payoffs from their hand, right? If they have gotten off to a really quick start, right, where they're an aggressive deck, well, if you can stabilize early, that's fine because they've invested a lot of resources into trying to kill you, and they usually can't find a way to draw more cards and refill, right? But Uro is really hard to exploit because it does all 3 things. It stabilizes you with the life gain, it draws you cards, it ramps you, right? So this is kind of like a case study in not great design because there's just like very few flaws in the card, and it's very frustrating to play against. So obviously, for our limited purposes, these kind of cards don't come up as much, but look for the future. Look into when we're evaluating cards that do similar things to Uro, right? Another case study that I think is really interesting is Nectropotence. So this is a really old school card. It's black, black, black for an enchantment. I'm not going to read the full text, but basically all you need to know is you can pay a life to draw a card. It's an enchantment that says pay a life, draw a card with some extra steps, basically. And I remember watching... So this is a really, really old match. It's the top 8 of like a 90s Pro Tour, and Randy Bueller, who is an old school player / Magic commentator who retired a few years ago, he was playing a Nectropotence deck, right? It was like a mono black Nectropotence deck where he had like some efficient creatures, and Nectropotence was like one of the most powerful cards in the deck. Obviously, it's a really powerful card, and the commentators commentating on the match were watching, and there was a point where Randy's at like 10 life or something, and he has a 2/2, and it was like a pretty good 2/2, and he chump blocks, right? And the commentator goes, "Oh, why would Randy chump block there? Like that doesn't make any sense. Like he's at 10. I don't understand why you would want to chump block with your good creature when you're at 10." And they're kind of berating him for it, right? And I don't remember where I saw this, but I remember him talking about the match years later at this point. And he said, well, what the commentators didn't quite take in at this point was that, like, by me chump blocking, every life I save is a card, right? So if I took 4 points of damage, right, from their attacker, I'm basically discarding 4 cards in a way, right? But if I'm preserving my life total, because I have this card that can convert life into cards, I just want to be throwing away cards. It doesn't matter, as long as I don't die, I'll be able to draw more cards and win the game. So the takeaway from this, I think, is think about in-game and as you're evaluating cards, when it is advantageous for you to trade one resource for another, right? A common example of this, and we're going to get into this a little bit later, is just like you have a lot of cards in hand and your opponent's attacking you with a 5/5. Well, it's probably okay to chump block with your 2/2 if like you have a lot of cards in hand, because you don't mind throwing that 2/2 away if you know that if the game just goes on a little bit longer, I can deploy my expensive cards and I can probably take over. Another case study, which is exchanging one resource for another. This one blew my mind, and this was truly a level up for me, where it was Pro Tour Shadows over Innistrad. And LSV drafts this deck with 2 copies of Fevered Visions, which is this rare enchantment. It's 1 blue-red. At the beginning of each player's end step, that player draws a card. If that player is your opponent and has 4 or more cards in hand, Fevered Visions deals 2 damage to him or her. So basically, this is a card that says both players just start drawing a bunch of cards each turn, and your hand's never empty, essentially, right? And Luis was talking about the deck, and he had 2 of these, so it was very consistent. He'd almost always have one of them each game, right? He'd always have this engine online. And he played multiple copies of Just the Wind, which is just a bounce spell. It's 2 mana, return target creature to its owner's hand. It has madness. And what he said about this interaction really blew my mind. He said, if both players are drawing a bunch of cards, they have like, cards aren't the bottleneck, then all that matters is mana, right? Because all that matters is who can stick threat, who can deploy their cards faster, and who can like stay on board. So Just the Wind, where traditionally is not a card you want to play like 4 copies of. You don't want to play 4 bounce spells. If you can guarantee that both players are just going to have a lot of cards in hand, and the game doesn't come down to who has the most cards in hand, who's battling on the card advantage front, it comes down to mana, then Just the Wind is a fantastic card, because you can afford to sacrifice a card for tempo. And that just blew my mind. I thought that was really, really cool. And so this leads us into the question that you can apply to a lot of situations, is what is the bottlenecked resource? And basically what I mean by the bottlenecked resource is, what is the resource that I need to focus on, in the sense that like, what resource do I have the least of? And this can be applied to a lot of things. It can be applied to formats. It can be applied to your deck. It can be applied to the game state, right? It's often important to figure out what the bottleneck resource is in a format, so that in that format you can prioritize that type of card, right? So for example, in Dominaria, that was a format where you really wanted to be developing your mana. You wanted to be hitting your 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th land drop, so you can cast like your big expensive spells, so you can kick spells. You have a lot of mana to like cast your kicker cards. And because of that, it was really important to prioritize mana producing cards and card draw, so you can keep hitting your land drops, right? Those were 2 of the more important things, and that was the bottleneck in the format, right? Was mana production. There's other formats where the bottleneck isn't cards at all, right? Really fast formats like Amonkhet, the bottleneck there is tempo, right? The format, you really want to get things on board quickly. It's just how quickly can you spew your hand out a lot of the time, right? Another thing you can think about is when you're drafting, right? It's like, well, what is my deck lacking? Is it lacking card advantage, ways to get cards? Is it lacking good tempo plays? Are all my things really expensive? Is it lacking cheap cards? And I'm going to be, if I'm lacking cheap cards, then life is going to be a problem because I'm going to be taking too much damage early, right? You can also apply this, we'll get to this a little bit later too. You can apply this to gameplay, where you're asking yourself, what should I do here in this given situation? One of the things you can do is ask yourself, what's my bottleneck resource? Am I really short on cards? Well, if I'm really short on cards, I don't want to just be trading willy-nilly. But if I'm really short on mana, well, the important thing there is to make sure I'm spending all my mana each turn so that I don't waste any mana. So that's just like something to consider in all departments, right? So next I'm going to talk about the application of these concepts to deck building, right? So when you have a bunch of card draw in your deck, I've got Field Research here, the card from Zendikar Rising, 2 blue, sorcery, kicker for 2 and a blue, draw 2 cards, and then if the spell was kicked, you can draw 3 cards, right? When you've got a lot of those type of cards in your deck, you really want to make sure your other bases are covered. And those other bases, of course, like I was saying before, are life and time, or mana production. So if I have a lot of card draw in my deck, I'm going to want to put a lot of cheap cards in my deck so that I can trade off early, so that it works 2 ways actually, because if you put a lot of cheap cards in your deck, you can trade off early so you get to leverage those card draw spells, but also if you have a lot of expensive cards in your deck plus card draw, you're not going to be able to deploy all the cards you draw in a timely fashion. If you've got, a bunch of 3s and 2s, your Field Research draws into those 3s and 2s, well, you can cast those the next turn, most likely. If you have a bunch of 6s, that's going to take a little longer, and you can get punished for that, right? The other thing, of course, when you have a bunch of card draw in your deck, is you want to put mana production in your deck. And Lone Mage is familiar, which is the golden common from Zendikar, if anybody remembers this. So this is 1 green-blue for a 2/4. It tapped to add blue or green, and whenever you kick a spell, you gain 2 life. This card was fantastic because it worked both ways, where it gives you mana production, right, but it also gives you life, right? So this was just such a fantastic card for being able to leverage your card draw spells, which is really cool. This is just, the point I talked about before, but you really want to make sure that when you have mana dorks in your deck, they're actually doing something for you. Don't just put mana dorks in your deck because you've heard, mana dorks are powerful cards. I've heard that just Spirit Sentinel is a high pick in Call Time Draft. I should take that. You want to make sure that it's actually generating mana, useful mana each turn, and you want to make sure that after it's kind of done its job, it can trade off somehow, either through equipment or through, a lot of times I would put village rights in my deck in call time, right? A single black mana, sacrifice a creature, draw 2 cards, because after my Spear Sentinel has done its work, I want to convert it into cards. That's something to think about. Another application for these concepts is in aggro decks, right? Where in aggro decks, you don't care as much about prioritizing the card resource, because your goal is generally in an aggro deck to kill your opponent before cards matter, right? So you're really like going all in, putting all your resources towards just putting your opponent's life total to 0. So what that means is you're often more willing to include cards in your deck like equipment, like Tormentor's Helm from Call Time. The single red mana, equipped creature gets +1/+1, right? And then it has some additional text about blocking, and it has equip 1. This isn't worth a card, quote unquote, by traditional, card evaluation metrics. But because you don't care so much about, is this card worth a card in my deck, you care about, does this help reduce my opponent's life total to 0? It's totally okay to, in your aggro decks, forsake some card draw, card advantage concepts for, I'm just using this card to deplete my opponent's life total, right? And in aggressive decks, the concept of card advantage kind of gets flipped on its head, of course, where the best, the joke is that the best card advantage is killing your opponent before they can deploy their hand, so you use that as you want as well. Like in your aggro decks, don't be super worried about gassing out. I guess that's actually an interesting point to talk about, where some people, when they're building their aggressive decks, they think, oh, won't I gas out? Like when I play aggressive decks, I tend to run out of cards, and it's like, yeah, you might, but that's not, like, you can't afford to put a divination in your deck when you're an aggressive deck. You just can't afford to have this card that will gas you up if you've run out of cards, because you're just hoping not to get to that point, right? You're just drafting and playing optimistically, where it's like, I'm just gonna kill them before that happens. The opportunity cost of having a card that doesn't affect the board in your aggro deck is really large, so you just can't put cards devoted to card advantage in your aggro decks, basically. So just to finish this out here, I want to talk about gameplay, how these concepts apply to gameplay, and I think this might be the most important part of this, I think, because so a lot of times when I'm on stream and I make kind of a play that looks a little bit weird or might be a little bit unintuitive, I realize that a lot of times when people ask, why did you make that play, that's a weird play, or I don't understand that play, it's often because I'm making a concession to, I've recognized we're in a game state where cards are really important, or tempo is really, really important, or my life total is really, really important, and I'm willing to go out of my way to make sure I don't fall behind on that resource, right? So, for example, if my opponent plays a 2-drop, right, and I feel like I've got a lot of good cards in hand, I have the choice between casting a creature to block their 2-drop or casting a card draw spell, right? If I have a lot of really expensive cards in hand and I'm stuck on 3 mana, sometimes I'll just cast that divination, that card draw spell, to hit my land drops, because I know that's more important than trading off with their 2-drop. Now, you can bring that back around a little bit and say, well, if you trade off with their 2-drop, that gives you more time to draw into more cards, but I know for myself, I need to hit those land drops now, because I need to cast my 4 and 5 drops in a timely fashion, right? So where some people would be like, I need to block because my life total is really important, I need to play a creature here, there's some spots where I go, I know that hitting my land drops is the most important thing. So that's something to consider, and just something to ask yourself in every game. So when you're trying to make tough decisions, and this is honestly a really big guiding factor for when I'm making decisions in game. I'm often asking myself, what is the most important resource in this given game, given my deck, and given the game state, and given my opponent's deck? So it could be cards, it could be life, it could be time, and it could be mana. And once you identify that, you can go forward with that and make decisions and make game actions based on that. One of the classic quotes from the greats, from John Finkel, is focus on what matters, right? Only focus on what matters. And of course, to John Finkel, it's very clear to know what matters in a game of Magic, right? But it's not always clear to every other Magic player. And I think this is, if you think about this, if you frame your games in this way of what is the most important resource at this time, I think that's a really good way to figure out what matters, basically. just a small point here I want to bring up is that the most unintuitive plays often come from recognizing that you're short on some sort of resource. Just like I was just talking about with what happens in Twitch chat sometimes when I make a seemingly strange play. Generally, if you are, a lot of times you have this a gut feeling where you're like, I'm supposed to be using my card like this. I'm supposed to play my 3-drop on turn 3, or I'm supposed to draw. I'm supposed to be using my card draw spell after I've dumped my hand because I want to gas up afterwards. I want to get on board early. I don't want to just play my draw spell on turn 3 for the privilege of having a few more options next turn, right? When a lot of times you'll find yourself in situations where you'll make an unintuitive play because you are short on that resource, and a play that might look kind of weird, and especially from the opponent's side, sometimes you're like looking at your opponents, you're like, why did they do that? Why did they chump block there? Like, why did they feel like they had to chump block when they're at 20, right? Sometimes they think, okay, as long as I don't go to a low life total, I'm just gonna be able to win this game, and that's just another thing to think about as you're making plays. That often, like, a kind of seemingly weird play, either from yourself or from your opponent, might be because one player recognizes that one of the resources is so critical that they need to preserve it, or they need to get more of it, right? Your baseline should be that cards are the most important resource. In Limited, I think this is definitely was more true 10 years ago or 20 years ago than it was now, where Limited formats were slower. But I do think, even today, your baseline should be, I want to be up the most cards, I want to make good exchanges on my cards, I want to make sure I'm making good trades or using my cards to good effect, right? Because I do think a lot of Limited games are won based on who has the most cards, right? Sometimes this is virtual cards, right? Sometimes it's my 5/5 bricks your 3/3s, right? That's like up a card in a sense because those 3/3s can't attack. But, just like broadly speaking, cards, I think, are the most important resource, and if you're asking yourself the question of what's the most important resource in a given turn or a given game state, the answer is often cards. So the question becomes, when is it, when should I not be valuing cards as a resource? And it's important to recognize when cards aren't the most important resource, and that's what we're going to talk about a little bit here. One of the things that I find in my coaching, or just like, players in general have this tendency, is they want to get all of the value out of every single card they possibly can in a game of Limited. Like, they will not give up a little bit of value on their card. That, if a card said, like, 3 mana 3/3 at the beginning of your upkeep, draw a card, right? That's a great card, obviously. But sometimes you're in situations where you just have to trade that off, right? And there's a lot of players who are just like, nope, their instincts are, I can't trade this card off, it's going to give me a lot of value. And I think that's the baseline. That's the right baseline to have, right? But you need to recognize when you shouldn't be trying to use every single part of the animal, right? When you need to just, like, trade off a resource because you're low on life or you're low on mana, right? If you're low on mana, you're missing, you have a lot of expensive cards in hand. Sometimes you just have to, again, like I said before, sometimes you just have to trade off your really important card. This comes up a lot where, you play a rare on turn 2, where you're like, oh, I don't want to trade off my rare. But if you're in an aggressive matchup where your opponent's aggroing you out, and your rare is your, say it's a good rare 2-drop, right? Your rare is your only card that you have to play on turn 2, and you're not playing a creature on turn 3, you just have to trade with your opponent's 2-drop creature, even though that rare is a very good card ostensibly, right? So, again, just going into some of the times when you should be not valuing cards as the most important resource is, number one, when you have a lot of cards in hand, right? This is the baseline. But this comes up later in the game where it's like, I wasn't able to deploy my cards as quickly as my opponent. I still have a lot of cards in hand. They're on 3 cards. They have a lot of cards on board. You should just be trading off. That's your baseline. Like, trade off the cards you've already played so you can play your cards in hand. Because if you trade off all the cards on board, when the dust settles, you'll be left with cards left because you have cards in hand, they don't, right? So that's a big thing. And I've seen a lot of players, like, not go for trades when they have 7 cards in hand or 6 cards in hand. And I think that often leads to their downfall in the game, because it's just like, no, you should just trade here, unless you have a really, really good reason to. You can make the argument that the cards in hand are cards that are better when you have a board, and that's certainly the case. And of course, there's going to be exception to these rules. You have to identify those. But as a baseline heuristic, when you have more cards in hand, bias towards trading off. The other thing is when you have a card advantage engine in play, right? I was playing Kaladesh Remastered the other day, and I had Ruler Virtuoso plus Era of Innovation, which, for people who have played the format, they know that's close to an infinite combo where you just make like all these 1/1 flyers. But for people who haven't played the format, it's this 2-card combo where, given enough time, you're just going to be able to make infinite 1/1 creatures, right? And because I have that value engine to play, I'm willing to chump block. I'm willing to use my removal spells on cards that don't really matter as much because I just don't want to die. Maybe I'm at 12, my opponent has like, I don't know, an unblockable creature, for example. Well, that thing's not going to kill me that quickly, and I can probably see a world where I kill them before that 3/3 deals 12 points, but I don't want to take that risk. If I have this sick value engine in play, I'm just going to be spewing out my cards, because I essentially have infinite cards, quote unquote, right? I just have like this engine that if I just don't die, I'm going to win. And that's similar for any card advantage engine. If you have going back to the Fever Divisions example, where you have this card that draws you multiple cards a turn. If you have something like that going, be a bit more willing to trade off, because if you're trading off your resources, then, if every exchange of card is just a 1-for-1, you're gonna come out ahead on that if you're drawing 2 cards a turn, of course, right? Another place to not value cards as the prime resource is when you're low on life, of course. The example I have here is you have a Windrake, a 3-mana 2/2 flyer. Your opponent has a Giganosaurus attacking you, which is a 5-mana 10/10. Well, if you have a lot of cards in hand, you should probably be figuring out ways to chump block this Giganosaurus. Obviously, you don't want to chump block every turn, because that's not going to lead to a win. But figure out ways that you can trade cards to not take 10 damage per turn, so you can actually find a way to deploy all your cards, right? This is an extreme example, of course, right? Like, you're not going to end up facing 10/10s every day, but if you are going back to, if you have a lot of cards in hand, you should be preserving your life total so you can have the time to cast all those cards. This comes with some nuance, of course. I'm not advocating for just chump blocking when you have 5 cards in hand to your opponent's 3 cards in hand. That's not something I would do, but it's a sliding scale, right? Like, there's going to be points in the game where you have to evaluate, do I think I'm going to win this long game if I just don't die? And if that's true, then think about chump blocking. I remember myself as a player when I was watching, when I was learning the game a little bit, a few years ago, and I was watching good players. They would chump block a little bit earlier than I would generally, and I'd be like, oh, that's really strange. Like, what? Like, doesn't that that 2/2 have some amount of value? Can't they double block on a future turn? And I think that's a valid way to think about it, but I think the way that they're thinking about it is exactly what I was describing there, where it's just good to chump when you're at like 10 life or something, because if you have 5 other creatures on board, that one creature probably won't be the difference between winning and losing, whereas like not going to 3 could be the difference between winning and losing. The more life you have to work with, the more you can do in a game, the more options you have, right? If you're lower on life, you kind of get forced into these situations a lot of times where you're priced into doing things, you're priced into making plays you don't really want to make, because if your life total goes to 0, you just die. So you go, well, I can't cast my best spell this turn because I'm at 3. I have to instead cast 2 lesser spells this turn and chump block with 1, right? You don't really want to get yourself into those positions, so you should use your life total as a resource for sure. Don't just like chump block from a high life total, but also realize when you're in a game state where it's like, if I go below 7 or 8 life, my plays in future turns get a lot worse. So that's something to consider when you're figuring out if you should chump block or not. The other thing, of course, this is more of a conceptual thing, but when you're playing an aggro deck, like I was talking about before, a lot of times people kind of scoff at the idea of putting an aura on your 1-mana 1/1 flyer, right? Much to my chagrin, and they're like, oh, like I don't want to 2-for on myself. Like I don't want to go down a card, right? Like that's just like such bad value. Again, you're not really worried about value in your aggro decks as much. Again, this is another subtle thing. It's sliding scales. You don't want to be throwing everything to the wind and just going like, if you had a card that said, discard your hand, target creature gets, +10/+10. That's a good card in some aggro decks, but you all wouldn't play it in other aggro decks as well, or you wouldn't, find a use for it in some game states, whereas some game states you would, right? I'm not saying you should throw away all of your cards. Just be a little bit more willing to, for the advantage of putting your opponent's life total to 0, basically. And I think here's one that comes up a lot, where we're talking about not getting all the value out of all your cards, or like, maybe using a card in an inopportune way. usually you'll use a card in an inopportune way when you're missing land drops. So an example of this is a big creature with cycling. Let's take Lava Serpent, right? 5 and a red for a 5/5. It has haste and it has cycling too. So obviously you'd like to get that thing on the battlefield. That's a really great card, right? But if you're in a situation where you're stuck on 3 lands, you should just cycle that thing, right? Just cycle it, especially if you have more expensive cards in hand. The important thing isn't to get value out of every single one of your cards, it's just to be able to cast most of your cards, right? So if I'm missing land drops early, I'll often take a turn off to cycle, especially if I have expensive stuff in my hand, right? Another example is one that comes up a lot in AFR with Plundering Barbarian, right? Where it's tempting to want to save your Plundering Barbarian to destroy an artifact or something, and there's definitely times that you should be saving your Plundering Barbarian to do so, right? But if I'm short on lands, if I'm on 3 lands, I'm definitely just casting that Barbarian, making a treasure, and casting my 5-drop next turn, right? So yeah, this is just a simple one. Figure out when you're low on mana and make the play that, you know, puts you down on cards / value, but puts you up on mana, lets you to cast your other cards. I think the last thing here that I want to talk about is when you need to kill a threat. So the example here I have here is a 5/5 is attacking you. You don't have 5 power worth of things to block it, but you have a Dragon's Fire in hand, right? And you have a 2/2. So it feels bad to to block with your 2/2 and then Dragon's Fire, but sometimes you do what you have to do, right? This is especially true when you're low on life, right? If you're high on life, don't worry, just take the 5 damage, use your life as a resource, but there comes a point where you just have to 2-for-1 yourself, right? I think a lot of players are resistant to, in the abstract, going, I'm just going to 2-for-1 myself, and it's definitely fair to be resistant to that, but also recognize the times where it's just what has to happen, right? For you to continue the game, you have to 2-for-1 yourself. And the tricky thing is, it's very obvious to notice that when you're at 2 life, when you're like, okay, I have to kill this thing. And it's very obvious to know when you're at 20 life, you don't have to do this. The tricky thing is when you're around like 10 life, when you're like, do I have to 2-for-1 myself? Can I take a hit from this 5/5 and go to 5? Or does my next turn look a lot worse if I go to 5? This is what I was talking about before, where you have to kind of assess the board state and go, how many decisions are cut off for me if I go to 5 life? Because if I don't get this 5/5 off the battlefield right now, it might be a lot worse for me next turn, where maybe that Dragonfire is even the only card you have left in your hand. You're like, I don't want to sacrifice this last card. But going to 10 is so much worse for XYZ reason, and yes, 2-for-1 yourself, kill the 5/5. You're leaving yourself outs to draw good cards and come back in the game after. Putting yourself to 5 leaves you in a lot worse spot a lot of the time, right? Okay, so just finishing up here, I want to talk about some matchup considerations, and I would suggest going to PV's article like I was talking about before. I think it's linked in the chat a little bit further up, and for those listening on audio, I'm going to link it in the show notes. He talks a lot about matchup considerations in Constructed, and while it's not quite applicable in the same way as it is for us in Limited, I do think a lot of the concepts carry over, and you can kind of broadly apply them to the types of decks you're facing. So we're going to talk about a few of them here. We're not going to go into depth, but just some things to think about, right? When you're playing an aggro deck with burn, when you're playing against an aggro deck that has burn spells, and when you're playing against an aggro deck that doesn't have burn spells, they often play out pretty differently. And this is something that PV goes into depth in, and I think he probably does a better job of explaining it than I do, but I just, for posterity's sake here, I want to explain it a little bit, where if you're in an aggressive matchup, let's say you're facing a white-green aggro deck, right? Your life total doesn't matter as much as it does as if you're facing a red aggro deck with burn spells, right? Or I should say, preserving your life total at all costs does not matter as much, right? Because in a white-green aggro deck, or against a white-green aggro deck, they don't have burn. If you go to 1, that's okay as long as you have stabilized. Now, there's some analogs for burn. There's evasive creatures. There's cards that make things unblockable. You have to consider that too. But the big picture idea here is that it's much more important to throw away other resources like cards or tempo for preserving your life total in matchups where burn is a factor, right? Where in matches where burn isn't a factor, like a green-white aggro deck is the most common thing, I think. Like, you can go to 1, as long as your board is stable, you can go to 1 and be pretty sure that you're not going to lose the game from there, right? But when you're facing something like cycling in Ikoria, I'm going to be chump blocking a little bit earlier than I would be because I know Zenith Flare might be just around the corner, right? Of course, you got to do the calculations of maybe I'm just dead to Zenith Flare anyways, it doesn't matter. But it's really important to do those calculations as you're going and chump block a little bit early sometimes, right? In a control versus control matchup, if you're two slow decks, the most important thing, of course, the most important resource is cards, right? It's just so important to be who's up on the most cards. It's okay to take damage a little bit early because that's not usually what the game's going to come down to. It's going to come down to board positioning and like who has accrued the most card advantage over the course of the game. So it's okay to like trade off early. It's okay, or it's okay to not trade off early and just take some damage because, like I said, the game's probably not going to come down to damage at that point. But the other important thing when I'm playing against a control deck, and I'm a control deck, is making sure I hit my land drops. Or even when I'm not a control deck, honestly, if I'm facing a control deck, it's often important to hit your land drops because you don't want the control deck to get to the point where they start double spelling or they start casting a card draw spell and casting a creature or holding up a counter spell or something like that, right? You want to keep pace with your opponent on lands when they're playing control deck or when you're playing a control deck because like being able to cast multiple spells later in the game is important, and often the player, if you're in a control versus control matchup, the player who falls behind on lands is the one that loses often. So that's just something to consider. And then the last matchup, which is probably just like a topic for another time, honestly, because it could be extrapolated on a lot, is aggro versus aggro. Where what should you do in an aggressive deck versus when you're playing an aggressive deck? Because obviously the baseline for when you're playing an aggressive deck is it's okay to sacrifice card advantage for tempo or getting your opponent's life total, depleting your opponent's life total. But like when your opponent is also playing with the same incentives, that creates a bit of a weird dynamic, right? And I would say it's not clear often what you're supposed to be doing. It really depends on each game. You really have to ask yourself who's the beatdown in each aggro matchup. Maybe you're an aggro deck that's a little bit bigger than your opponent's aggro deck, so you're not the beatdown, right? So you should be prioritizing your life total and cards over, like killing your opponent as fast as you can, right? So that's really important to identify. But the thing I would want to point out is if you are two evenly matched aggro decks, like your aggro decks of similar cards and similar sizings where like your 2/2 is going to trade with their 2/2, your 3/3 is going to trade with their 3/3, stuff like that, it often actually comes down to who has the most cards, which is like kind of unintuitive, right? Because you don't think of aggro decks as like being a deck that you play that you care about who's up the most cards. But if every card is just trading for a card, then who has the most cards at the end is going to determine the matchup. So how this manifests a lot of the time is like you want to be careful of not getting blown out 2-for-1 on a double block or something like that, right? Because like your opponent's going to keep their board around, you're going to lose 2 creatures, right? Because there aren't mechanics in either decks often that like will be like, oh, I catch up on cards to draw 2 cards, there's no divinations or anything like that. You often care a lot more about getting onboard 2-for-1s, and getting onboard 2-for-1s is often the way you win aggressive matchups. And that's just another thing to think about. It's the reason why in old school constructed, aggro decks would often take the draw, right? Because being up 1 card was often more important than tempo. Because if your deck is full of a bunch of cheap removal, a bunch of shocks, a bunch of lightning bolts, the most important thing is being up a card, not being up tempo, because everything in the deck is just so cheap, so it doesn't really matter, right? Okay, I think that's it. I just want to thank you all for hanging out. Really appreciate that. Once again, if you enjoyed the content, check out patreon.com/limitedlevelups. Really appreciate all the support. Again, thank you to all the supporters in the past week who joined. Really appreciate that, and all the supporters who continuously join. Could not do the show without you. I love doing the show every week, and I hope to keep doing it as long as I possibly can. If you like my content at all, that's one of the best places to go to support me. As always, we're going to turn it to chats to ask some questions. I figure this one's probably going to have less questions than some podcast or than some episodes, just because it's a bit more of a theoretical, conceptual thing. But chat, if you have questions, feel free to send them at me. Oh, that's a great question, Clarm. So can you talk a little bit about inflection points, which is, kind of a buzzword that you hear content creators talking about sometimes. I talk about it a lot. Signs that the game has gone from being about one resource to another. How do you recognize them and how do you pivot? Yeah, that's really important. That's something that I actually didn't touch on. So it takes a bit of practice, I would say, right? It's something that I think really good players are able to identify on the dime, right? And they're able to go like, now the game is about this, now the game is about that. It's now about cards, it's now about tempo, right? If you're somebody who is trying to develop your skills and trying to figure out when games have shifted from being about cards to being about life or about time, about tempo, I would say that probably the most important thing is when things start to not go your way is probably actually the most critical red flag. Because if you're just playing a game where you're like, okay, my deck is carrying out the things that it does, like it's humming. Obviously, if you're just like, okay, like I missed 10 land drops in a row, the game is not going to go your way because you're down one resource incredibly far, right? But if things seem to be like going reasonably well, but you realize, I'm starting to lose this game. Things are starting to pull away from me. I would zoom out a little bit and say, all right, that's when you can ask yourself the question of what's the most important resource here? Do I not have enough of a board here to really leverage my cards in hand? And do I think I'm going to die soon, right? If that's true, definitely focus from like casting a card draw spell or something that doesn't impact the board to, putting cards in the battlefield, right? Likewise, if you're in a position where you don't have a lot of cards in hand, right? And you're trying to like end the game and your opponent has a lot of cards in hand. If you are in a position where you're like, okay, I don't really have very good attacks. I don't think that I can get into good attack here. I think a lot of players tend to just go, I got to end the game. Let's just attack here. Let's just screw it, But I would caution you and just go, if you don't think you can end the game, if you're in a point where you're like, my creatures like don't get through my opponent's creatures anymore, or I can't attack for enough damage, like just know that if you can't deplete your opponent's life source, the game is going to become about cards very, very soon. So I would caution and ask yourself, can I just stop attacking for a second and see if I can recoup some lost cards here? Like, can I like, maybe that's just not possible. Maybe your deck is so one-dimensional where, like, that's the only thing it's doing. But if you're, like, in a mid-range deck and you're, like, you've been aggressive for most of the time, and you do have some card draw in your deck, or you do have some engine cards, or cards that can just catch you up, just, like, powerful rares or something, like, stop for a second, basically. Because at that point, you are incentivized to go, I want this game to be about cards, not about killing my opponent. Is a deck that counters both aggro and control destined to fail? Should a deck try to be a counter to a specific archetype? That's an interesting question. So I would say two things to that. One, I would say don't necessarily think of your deck as like trying to counter your opponent's deck. I think first and foremost, you should think about like what your deck does. Like try to have your deck do a thing, and that thing might incidentally be very good against aggressive decks or very good against control decks. But I would, from a conceptual standpoint, not ask myself, like, how does my deck counter other decks? It would be more like, how is my deck carrying out its own plan, right? As far as your other question is there, like, the other part of the question, is there a deck that tries, if a deck tries to counter is both aggro and control, is it destined to fail? So, like, fundamentally, mid-range decks try to play both roles, right? They try to survive versus the aggro decks, and they try to have late game versus the control decks. And I think that a poorly built mid-range deck certainly can fail in that department, where it doesn't defend. It has too many like cards in its deck that are designed to be good in the controlling matchups, so it falls behind in the aggressive matchups, and vice versa. Has too many cheap cards, and so it gets outclassed and outcarded by the control decks. So I would say yes, and I would say if you are a mid-range deck, make sure you have a really good balance of the cheap stuff and the expensive stuff. The best cards for mid-range decks are cards that play both roles very well. So something like Serap's Packmate is like the quintessential great mid-range card because it's very good against aggressive decks. It comes down, blocks early, but it is also a card advantage tool against the controlling decks, right? So the cards that you want to play in your mid-range decks tend to be cards that are good against both aggressive decks and controlling decks. You want to kind of not put your eggs in one basket too much and be like, let me play a bunch of cheap stuff or let me play a bunch of expensive stuff, because then you can fall into the trap of being bad in one matchup and the other, or like drawing your cards out of order. Like you draw your cheap stuff against the control deck and that's really bad for you. You draw your expensive stuff against the aggressive decks, right? Related, Metal Mario says, do you find that mid-range decks are becoming increasingly obsolete in modern limited formats? Yeah, I think this might be a good question to extrapolate on as well, Metal Mario. Where, in like another podcast episode, where I think there's been the, you hear the don't be mid-range, I think phrase a lot of the time. I mean, I think I was one of the people that maybe started that, and I think it's gone a little bit too far in the sense that, like, so yes, I think you're right. You should try to be focused, Metal Mario. I think that you should try to be aggressive or try to be controlling. Don't try to fall in between. Again, this kind of goes back to the other question that was asked. Like, the mid-range decks can falter a lot of the time if they aren't built correctly. So there's a lot of danger in there in not building your mid-range decks correctly. So I think a topic to explore on a later time is how to build your mid-range decks correctly, how to be mid-range, basically. But I do agree, a lot of the limited formats have incentivized you to be on one end of the spectrum, either really controlling or really aggressive, for sure. But I will say that there's a lot of room for good mid-range decks if built correctly, and players like Jason, who's, I think an up-and-coming name in the limited grinder scene, who just, like, is being, first place mythic and puts out a bunch of great content himself on Twitter. He's a big proponent of mid-range decks, and maybe that's a future episode. Maybe that'd be a cool episode to have him on and talk about mid-range, because I think he's a real pro at building good mid-range decks. All right, I think we'll wrap it up from there. Once again, thank you everybody for joining. If you're listening to this in podcast form, it's going to be on the YouTube if you want to watch it in visual form. And for everybody who has access to the show notes, those are going to go up tonight after the show goes up as well. Thank you everybody for hanging out, and we'll see you next time on the next episode of Limited Level Ups.